The transmission arrived at 300 hours Greenwich Mean Time, shattering the fragile peace of a world that had only recently begun to heal from centuries of conflict. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood motionless, her augmented prosthetic hand clenching involuntarily as the holographic image of Ambassador Krell-9 materialized in the United Earth Diplomatic Center. The Vexnar representative was a marvel of crystalline engineering, a being composed of interconnected geometric shapes that shifted and realigned with each syllable. Its voice resonated not just through sound waves, but through a complex matrix of quantum communication frequencies that made every display screen, every communication device on Earth pulse with an alien rhythm. Humanity, the ambassador began, its translucent form casting prismatic shadows across the conference room. Your civilization has been identified as the final autonomous entity in Sector 7 Gamma. Your technological development has reached a point of minimal interest. Surrender is your only logical option. The room fell silent. General Marcus Chen, a veteran of the lunar conflicts, watched the crystalline being with eyes that had seen too much to be intimidated. Beside him, Jake Williams, a cybernetics specialist with a reputation for impossible solutions, was already running complex algorithms through his neural interface. Elena leaned forward, her trained ear catching something beneath the transmission. A flutter, a micro-hesitation in the alien's communication that suggested something more. Years of xenolinguistic research had taught her that communication was never just about words. Outside, the world was erupting into chaos. Stock markets plummeted. Military bases went into high alert. In Tokyo, New York, Lagos, and Sao Paulo, people poured into streets, their collective anxiety creating a global wave of panic and defiance. The Vexnar's message was brutally simple. Humanity would be assimilated. Resistance was mathematically impossible. They presented cold, irrefutable data showing their conquest of over 200 galactic civilizations. Each civilization had been systematically integrated, their technologies absorbed, their cultures dismantled. But something in Elena's prosthetic hand, a piece of technology she had personally designed after losing her arm in a deep space exploration mission, was collecting data. Micropatterns in the transmission that the Vexnar hadn't intended to reveal. 30 solar cycles, Ambassador Krell-9 concluded. 30 cycles to prepare for complete integration. Your resistance is calculated at 0.00037% probability of success. As the transmission ended, Elena turned to Chen and Williams. "Did you see it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jake's neural interface was already processing massive amounts of data. "See what?" "The hesitation," Elena replied. "The smallest fracture in their perfect communication. They're not as invincible as they want us to believe." General Chen's weathered face broke into the first genuine smile in weeks. "Then we'd better get to work." Across the planet, something unprecedented began to happen. Universities became war rooms. Tech companies transformed their facilities into research centers. Every human skill, from street-level engineering to quantum physics, began to mobilize. The countdown had begun. 30 solar cycles to save humanity. 30 cycles to prove that mathematics wasn't everything. 30 cycles to show the Vexnar that humanity was anything but predictable. In the United Earth Diplomatic Center, 3 people looked at each other, a linguist, a general, and a tech genius, and knew that the real battle was just beginning. The 30 solar cycles became a crucible of human potential. Every institution, every individual transformed into a weapon of survival. Universities converted lecture halls into strategic planning centers. Silicon Valley became a military-industrial complex that would have been unimaginable mere weeks before. Captain Aria Okoro stood in the Global Resistance Command Center, her fingers dancing across holographic displays that tracked the planet's metamorphosis. Former tech companies now produced advanced weaponry. Agricultural research facilities developed biological countermeasures. Even entertainment industries repurposed their virtual reality technologies for training and simulation. Jake Williams had become the architect of humanity's technological resistance. His team worked around the clock, developing communication disruption protocols that defied conventional logic. They studied the Vexnar's previous conquests, looking for the smallest vulnerabilities. "It's not about beating their technology," Jake explained to a room of skeptical military strategists. "It's about introducing unpredictability into their system." His breakthrough came from an unlikely source. A group of street artists in Rio de Janeiro had developed a complex visual language that could communicate multiple meanings simultaneously. Jake adapted their techniques into a communication algorithm that could potentially blind the Vexnar's predictive systems. Dr. Elena Rodriguez continued her linguistic research, diving deep into the micro-hesitations she detected in the initial transmission. Her team included linguists, mathematicians, and quantum communication specialists from every corner of the globe. They worked to create a communication strategy that went beyond traditional language, a method of interaction that the Vexnar couldn't easily categorize or predict. The first test came sooner than expected. Vexnar scout ships began probing Earth's defenses, expecting a simple reconnaissance mission. What they encountered was anything but predictable. A fleet of modified commercial space freighters, repurposed with experimental drive systems, engaged the scout ships. They moved with a fluidity that defied standard combat algorithms. Instead of traditional military formations, the human ships behaved like a swarm of intelligent insects, unpredictable, adaptive, constantly changing. Captain Okoro led the first engagement from the bridge of the RSS Mandela, a ship cobbled together from 3 different spacecraft designs. Her team included pilots from every continent, each bringing their unique cultural approach to combat. "They expect precision," Okoro communicated to her fleet. "We'll give them chaos." The battle became a demonstration of human ingenuity. Ships used gravitational anomalies as weapons. They employed solar wind and planetary magnetic fields in ways the Vexnar's computational models couldn't predict. A group of pilots from Mumbai used an algorithm based on traditional Indian street traffic patterns to create impossible attack vectors. Meanwhile, on Titan, a colony previously considered a minor outpost, something extraordinary was happening. The colonists, cut off from primary Earth communications, had been developing their own survival strategies. Using the Moon's complex methane reserves and intricate underground tunnel systems, they prepared a counterattack that would shock the Vexnar. General Chen watched the initial engagements with a mixture of pride and tension. "We're not just fighting," he told his command staff. "We're rewriting the rules of conflict." The Vexnar began to realize that their initial assessment of humanity was fundamentally flawed. This wasn't a civilization that could be easily categorized or conquered. Every human became a potential resistance point. Every piece of technology a potential weapon. In universities, schools became training grounds. Children learned communication encryption alongside mathematics. Grandparents who had survived previous global conflicts shared strategies of resistance. The entire planet was transforming into a single adaptive organism. As the first month of the 30-cycle countdown passed, the Vexnar found themselves facing something unprecedented. Humanity wasn't just resisting, they were evolving. The initial conflict had begun, and nothing would ever be the same. The Vexnar's response was swift and calculated. Their first major assault targeted Earth's communication infrastructure, believing a knockout blow would cripple human resistance. They were catastrophically wrong. What they didn't understand was that humanity had already decentralized its entire communication network. Every satellite, every communication tower, every personal device had been transformed into a potential relay point. When the Vexnar struck, they found themselves fighting a hydra. Cut down one communication channel, and a dozen more would emerge. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood at the heart of this communication revolution. Her team had developed what they called linguistic viruses, communication packets that were part language, part mathematical paradox, part emotional complexity. Each transmission was a puzzle that would take the Vexnar's computational systems exponential time to decode. "We're not just sending messages," Elena explained to her team. "We're sending cognitive landmines." The Titan colony became humanity's most unexpected weapon. Led by Dr. Camara Wilson, a geological engineer with a background in extreme environment survival, the colonists had transformed their methane-rich environment into a defensive nightmare. They used the moon's complex geological structure to create weapons that defied traditional warfare. Their first major counterattack came when a Vexnar carrier fleet approached the Saturn system. The Titan colonists didn't just defend. They attacked with a strategy that seemed to emerge from the planet itself. Massive methane geysers were weaponized. Underground tunnel networks became launch points for swarm attacks that completely destroyed 3 carrier ships. Jake Williams continued his technological warfare. His communication disruption protocols had evolved into something between a weapon and a living system. Each time the Vexnar adapted, his algorithms would shift, creating new patterns of resistance. Captain Aria Okoro led a series of hit-and-run attacks that became legendary. Her fleet, composed of ships from every nation, moved like a global immune system. They would appear, strike with devastating precision, and vanish before the Vexnar could mount a proper response. In low Earth orbit, a new type of warfare emerged. Instead of traditional space battles, human ships would use entire asteroids as weapons. They would nudge these massive objects into calculated trajectories, turning celestial bodies into kinetic missiles that could obliterate entire Vexnar formations. The alien collective began to experience something unprecedented: uncertainty. Their initial data showed a 63% probability of human extinction. But with each passing solar cycle, that probability began to shift. Small changes, microscopic variations, but for a species that relied entirely on predictive algorithms, these variations were terrifying. Humanity's resistance wasn't just military, it was total. Agricultural systems were weaponized. Medical research became a frontline defense. Even entertainment industries contributed, with virtual reality systems being used to train resistance fighters in complex scenarios. Schools became training grounds. Every child learned basic encryption. Every citizen understood their role in the global resistance. The line between civilian and military completely disappeared. The Vexnar had conquered civilizations by offering a simple proposition: surrender and live, integrate and survive. But humanity offered something they couldn't comprehend: a third option: resistance, adaptation, evolution. As the second phase of the 30-cycle countdown approached, the Vexnar realized they were facing something entirely new. This wasn't just a civilization fighting for survival. This was a species fighting to redefine the very concept of survival. Dr. Hiroshi Nakamura knew he was dying. The terminal illness that had plagued him for years now seemed almost irrelevant in the face of humanity's greatest challenge: his quantum entanglement communication project. Years of research that most of his colleagues had dismissed as impossible would become his final, most important contribution to humanity. The laboratory beneath the Tokyo Institute of Advanced Technologies was a controlled chaos of quantum computing systems, holographic interfaces, and experimental communication arrays. Nakamura's team worked with a desperate intensity, knowing that their leader's time was running out. "We're not just creating a communication network," Nakamura told his lead researcher, Dr. Maizong, during one of their final collaborative sessions. "We're building a nervous system for human resistance." The breakthrough came on a cold Tuesday morning. The quantum entanglement communication network didn't just transmit information. It created a living, breathing network of resistance that could not be blocked, interrupted, or predicted. General Chen recognized the potential immediately. This wasn't just a communication tool. It was a weapon of unprecedented sophistication. Using the new network, humanity began to reach out to civilizations previously thought completely assimilated by the Vexnar. The communication was more than just a message. It was a spark of hope, a reminder of individual identity that had been suppressed for generations. The first response came from the Zornak, a silicon-based species that had been under Vexnar control for over 3 centuries. Their message was simple but profound. We remember who we were. Across the galaxy, other subjugated civilizations began to stir. The Vexnar had believed their assimilation was complete, but the quantum network revealed the truth. Resistance had always been possible. It just needed a catalyst. Captain Aria Okoro saw an opportunity. She proposed a bold, almost suicidal mission. Using the new communication network, she would broadcast a direct challenge to the Vexnar collective consciousness. The holographic transmission was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. General Chen appeared, standing on the bridge of the RSS Mandela, surrounded by a diverse crew representing every continent and multiple genetic backgrounds. "We are not just fighting for ourselves," Chen's message proclaimed. "We are fighting for every civilization you have tried to erase, every culture you have tried to assimilate, every individual you have tried to suppress." The transmission went beyond words. It was a demonstration of something the Vexnar could not comprehend: the power of individual spirit, of collective diversity, of hope. Jake Williams had prepared something special for this transmission. Hidden within the communication were complex algorithmic patterns, linguistic viruses that would slowly infiltrate the Vexnar's collective computational systems. Dr. Elena Rodriguez worked alongside him, introducing emotional complexity into mathematical algorithms. Each transmission was a puzzle, a challenge to the Vexnar's understanding of communication and consciousness. The response was immediate and unexpected. The Vexnar collective showed the first signs of internal fracture. Minor at first, just microscopic variations in their collective response. But for a species that relied entirely on perfect computational unity, these variations were seismic. Nakamura watched the initial results from his hospital bed, a weak smile crossing his face. His life's work had become humanity's greatest weapon. "We're not just sending a message," he whispered to Dr. Zhang. "We're sending a revolution." As the quantum network spread, something unprecedented happened. Civilizations that had been silent for generations began to communicate. The Vexnar's perfect, unified control began to show its first real cracks. The turning point had arrived, and humanity had just changed the rules of galactic conflict forever. Earth transformed into a global fortress that defied every conventional understanding of defense. Cities became living, breathing ecosystems of resistance. Tokyo's underground networks became manufacturing centers. Sao Paulo's favelas turned into training grounds for guerrilla communication warfare. New York's financial district was repurposed into a global coordination hub. Every citizen became a potential warrior. Schools taught resistance strategies alongside mathematics. Children learned complex encryption before they learned to read. Grandparents who had survived previous global conflicts became strategic advisors, sharing hard-earned wisdom about survival and adaptation. The Vexnar launched what they believed would be their final devastating assault, a massive fleet that would obliterate any known civilization. But they encountered a planet that had become something entirely new. A single adaptive organism with billions of independent yet interconnected components. Underground resistance networks developed technologies that blurred every line between civilian and military infrastructure. Agricultural drones were modified into surveillance and communication networks. Medical nanobots became potential weapons. Even entertainment systems were repurposed for training and coordination. Captain Aria Okoro's resistance cells operated with a fluidity that completely defied traditional military doctrine. A group of resistance fighters in the Amazon rainforest could coordinate with urban teams in Mumbai, using communication protocols that changed every millisecond. The Vexnar's predictive algorithms became increasingly useless. Jake Williams continued to push the boundaries of technological warfare. His team developed what they called cognitive camouflage. Communication systems that could mimic, adapt, and ultimately misdirect the Vexnar's computational tracking. Dr. Elena Rodriguez of linguistic warfare reached new heights. Her team created communication packets that were part language, part mathematical puzzle, part emotional complexity. Each transmission was designed to introduce subtle cognitive dissonance into the Vexnar's collective consciousness. The Titan colony became a proving ground for humanity's most radical adaptations. Led by Dr. Camara Wilson, the colonists transformed their entire environment into a defensive complex. They used the moon's methane reserves, complex geological structures, and extreme environment survival technologies to create weapons and defensive systems that seemed to emerge from the planet itself. Global manufacturing had been completely reimagined. What once took months now took hours. 3D printing facilities could produce entire spacecraft components in minutes. Every major city had been converted into a potential production center, with supply chains that could shift and adapt faster than the Vexnar could track. The psychological warfare was equally sophisticated. Humanity didn't just resist. They challenged the very foundations of the Vexnar's understanding of civilization. Every transmission, every engagement was designed to introduce uncertainty. General Chen oversaw this global transformation with a strategic vision that went beyond traditional military thinking. "We're not just fighting a war," he would tell his strategists. "We're demonstrating a new way of existing." The Vexnar began to experience something unprecedented, genuine uncertainty. Their computational models, which had predicted victory with 63% probability, now showed increasing variations, small changes, microscopic shifts. But for a species that relied entirely on perfect predictability, these variations were terrifying. As the third phase of the 30-cycle countdown approached, it became clear that this was no longer just a conflict between two civilizations. This was a war that would redefine the very concept of survival. The final battle was nothing like any conflict in galactic history. It was fought simultaneously on multiple fronts: physical, digital, psychological, and computational. The very definition of warfare was being rewritten with each passing moment. Captain Aria Okoro's strike team boarded the primary Vexnar mothership using a method that defied all traditional boarding strategies. They didn't just infiltrate, they transformed the very nature of infiltration. Their entry point was a communication signal, a complex quantum transmission that simultaneously served as both a weapon and an entry method. As they moved through the ship's crystalline corridors, they were more than just a boarding party. They were a living, adaptive system that changed with each encounter. Dr. Elena Rodriguez's communication paradoxes had been preparing for this moment. The linguistic viruses they had developed began to create actual fractures in the Vexnar's collective consciousness. Each transmission was a cognitive landmine, introducing emotional complexity into a system built entirely on pure logic. Jake Williams launched a multi-layered cyber attack that turned the Vexnar's own predictive algorithms against them. It wasn't just about breaking their systems, it was about making them question the very foundation of their existence. The battle played out across multiple dimensions. In physical space, human ships moved with an unpredictability that completely overwhelmed the Vexnar's computational tracking. In the quantum communication spectrum, humanity introduced variations that were more than just noise. They were a form of distributed consciousness. General Chen coordinated the global effort from the RSS Mandela, a ship that was itself a testament to human adaptability. Built from 3 different spacecraft designs, crewed by individuals from every continent, it represented something the Vexnar could not comprehend: strength through diversity. The Titan colony launched its most audacious attack. Using the moon's complex geological systems, they transformed entire sections of their environment into weapons. Massive methane geysers became propulsion systems. Underground tunnel networks became launch points for swarm attacks that decimated entire Vexnar formations. In orbit around Earth, the battle became a 3-dimensional chess match that defied all traditional understanding of space combat. Human ships used entire asteroids as kinetic weapons. They would nudge these massive objects into calculated trajectories, turning celestial bodies into missiles that could obliterate entire alien formations. But the true battle was happening on a level the Vexnar had never anticipated. It was a war of consciousness. of individual identity, of the fundamental right to exist as a unique, imperfect being. Okoro's strike team reached the central consciousness chamber of the Vexnar mothership. What they found was not a traditional command center, but a living computational matrix that represented the collective's entire being. "We are offering you a choice," Okoro transmitted, her message simultaneously a weapon and an invitation. Not surrender, not destruction, but transformation. The Vexnar collective experienced something it had never known before: genuine uncertainty. Microscopic variations began to appear in their unified consciousness. Individual threads of thought started to emerge. This was more than a military victory. This was a fundamental challenge to the very concept of collective existence. The climax had arrived, and humanity had just rewritten the rules of galactic interaction. The Vexnar did not simply surrender. They transformed. In the weeks following the climactic battle, something unprecedented occurred. The collective consciousness that had dominated galactic civilization for centuries began to fragment, not through destruction, but through a process of individual awakening. Dr. Elena Rodriguez led the initial diplomatic efforts. Her team of linguists, psychologists, and communication specialists worked to facilitate a dialogue that was more than just an exchange of information. It was a process of mutual understanding. The first signs of change were subtle. Individual Vexnar entities began to show signs of independent thought. Micro-variations in their crystalline structures indicated the emergence of something that had been suppressed for generations: individual identity. Diplomatic meetings became more than traditional negotiations. They were fundamental explorations of consciousness. The human delegation didn't approach the Vexnar as a defeated enemy, but as potential partners in a new form of galactic interaction. Jake Williams and his technology team developed communication interfaces that could bridge the gap between human emotional complexity and the Vexnar's computational thinking. These weren't just translation devices. They were cognitive bridges that allowed for genuine cross-species understanding. The former Vexnar territories began to transform. Civilizations that had been under collective control for centuries started to rediscover their individual cultures. It wasn't a process of rebellion, but of awakening. Captain Aria Okoro oversaw the initial peacekeeping efforts. Her approach was revolutionary. Instead of military occupation, she established collaborative zones where different species could interact, learn, and grow together. General Chen worked on developing a new galactic framework. The proposal was radical: a network where diversity was the primary resource, where individual innovation was the most valuable currency. It wasn't about creating a new hierarchy, but about establishing a truly collaborative system of interaction. The Titan colony became a key diplomatic center. Dr. Camara Wilson and her team demonstrated how a complex, adaptive environment could become a model for interspecies cooperation. Their technologies, developed in one of the most challenging environments in the solar system, became a blueprint for collaborative survival. Slowly, the Vexnar began to understand something fundamental: that their previous model of existence was not the only possible way of being. Individual Vexnar entities started to separate from the collective, showing the first signs of what humans would recognize as personality. Scientific and cultural exchanges became the new form of conflict resolution. Universities became the new diplomatic centers. Research facilities became zones of mutual exploration. The human approach was not about conquest or destruction. It was about offering an alternative, a way of existing that celebrated individual potential while maintaining collective cooperation. Some of the most profound changes happened in unexpected ways. Art became a critical tool of communication. Music, visual arts, and performance became methods of bridging the fundamental differences between species. Dr. Rodriguez discovered that emotional complexity, something the Vexnar had previously considered a weakness, was actually a sophisticated form of information processing. Human emotions were not random fluctuations, but complex adaptive systems that allowed for rapid problem-solving and innovative thinking. As the 30 solar cycles came to an end, it became clear that humanity had done something far more significant than winning a war. They had demonstrated a fundamentally different approach to civilization, one based on adaptability, individual potential, and collective growth. The galaxy would never be the same. 10 years after the conflict, Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood on the observation deck of the Galactic Collaborative Center, watching the sunset over New Geneva. The facility, built on the site of the original United Earth Diplomatic Center, now served as the primary hub for interspecies communication and research. Behind her, a delegation of former Vexnar collective members worked alongside human, Zornak, and dozen other species, each maintaining their unique identity while contributing to a larger, more complex system of interaction. The transformation had been more profound than anyone could have anticipated. The former Vexnar territories had become a vibrant, dynamic region of cultural and technological exchange. Humanity was no longer seen as a conquering species, but as catalysts of a new form of galactic cooperation. Jake Williams, now leading the Interspecies Communication Research Institute, had developed technologies that allowed for unprecedented levels of cross-species understanding. What had begun as communication disruption protocols had evolved into sophisticated empathy interfaces that could bridge fundamentally different forms of consciousness. Captain Aria Okoro commanded the Galactic Peacekeeping Fleet, not as a military force, but as a collaborative protection network. Her ships were as much about cultural exchange and mutual defense as they were about traditional security. The Titan colony had become a model of adaptive civilization. Dr. Camaro Wilson's technologies for surviving in extreme environments were now being applied to collaborative settlements across multiple planets. What had begun as a survival strategy had become a blueprint for interspecies cooperation. General Chen, now serving as the primary diplomatic advisor, reflected on how completely the concept of conflict had changed. War was no longer about destruction, but about understanding. Competition had been replaced by collaborative innovation. The title, "The Day Humanity Came to Stay," had taken on a deeper meaning. Humanity hadn't just survived, they had transformed the very nature of galactic interaction. Individual #, "The Day Humanity Came to Stay."